Carl Jung said that everything that is not made conscious appears in our life as fate. Welcome to the shadow of marriage. There is a moment that happens in almost every marriage that contains this pattern, and it arrives without warning and without ceremony, and it is one of the most disorienting experiences a woman can have in an intimate relationship. She is not asking for something extraordinary. She is not making a demand that requires heroic emotional effort. She is simply in the way that people who love each other are supposed to be able to, simply needing him. Maybe she received difficult news and needs to be held while she processes it. Maybe she is frightened about something and needs to hear his voice say that it will be all right. Maybe she is exhausted in the specific, accumulated way that life produces exhaustion, and she needs just for a moment to not be alone in it. The need is real. The need is reasonable. The need is exactly the kind of need that marriage is supposed to exist to meet, and he shuts down, not aggressively, not cruelly. There is no fight, no cold dismissal, no obvious rejection. What happens is something more bewildering than any of those things. He becomes unavailable, is the word that most women reach for, but it is not quite precise enough. He becomes unreachable. Something closes in him. His eyes go somewhere else. His responses become shorter, more careful, more managed. The quality of his presence in the room changes from warm to neutral, to something that feels in the specific way that emotional withdrawal always feels to the person on the receiving end of it, like a door that has just been quietly closed from the inside, and she is standing on the outside of it, with her needs still in her hands, not understanding what just happened or what she did to cause it. In my years of clinical practice working with couples, I have heard this experience described more times than I can count, always in slightly different language, always in slightly different circumstances, but always with the same essential quality of bewilderment, not anger in the first instance. The anger tends to come later, after the bewilderment has had time to harden, but bewilderment. The specific, destabilizing confusion of a woman who reached toward the person she chose to spend her life with and found, in the moment she needed him most, that he was not available to be reached. What I want to do in this video is explain what is actually happening in that moment, not with reassurances that it does not mean what she fears it means, not with a list of communication tips for getting a better response next time, but with the clinical and psychological precision that actually changes how she understands it, and therefore changes in a way that nothing else can, how she responds to it. Because the way she responds to it matters enormously, and the response that feels most natural, most justified, most reasonable in the moment, the response of escalating, of pressing harder, of refusing to let the door stay closed, is almost always, for reasons that are deeply grounded in psychology and neuroscience, the response that makes the closing more complete. If you are watching this, and the description of that moment landed somewhere real, if you recognized in the image of the door closing the specific quality of something you have been living with, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel now and turn on notifications, because this conversation is part of a series that goes somewhere most relationship content does not reach, and every video builds on the last in ways that matter. Let me tell you about a woman I will call Megan. Megan was 38 years old when she first came to see me. She had been married for 10 years to a man named Ryan, a financial analyst, steady and reliable in his professional life, someone who had been, in the early years of their relationship, genuinely warm. not effusive. He had never been the kind of man who talked easily about feelings or who reached for emotional expression as a first language, but warm, present in the specific way that matters, attentive, responsive, the kind of man who noticed when something was wrong and who showed up in his quiet and practical way to address it. That quality had changed. Not suddenly and not completely. Ryan was still, in most of the functional dimensions of their marriage, present and reliable. He provided. He showed up for the children. He maintained the infrastructure of the shared life with the same steady competence that had always characterized him. But in the specific territory of emotional need, in the moments when Megan needed not the functional husband but the person, the man she had married, the one who used to be able to hold her difficulty without immediately trying to fix it or escape it, he was no longer reliably there. The pattern had become, over the preceding 2 years, almost predictable in its consistency. Megan would bring something emotionally significant to Ryan, something she was worried about, something that had hurt her, something that required not a solution, but simply his presence and his willingness to be with her in it. And Ryan would, with a consistency that had progressed from occasional to reliable to almost absolute, shut down, become quieter, become more careful, offer responses that were technically appropriate and emotionally hollow, or, in the more difficult instances, simply remove himself, finding something that needed doing in another room, checking his phone with a focus that had not been there a moment before, offering the specific quality of polite unavailability that is more isolating than open rejection because it cannot be directly addressed. Megan had tried everything she could think of to change this pattern. She had tried being less emotional in how she approached him, delivering her needs in a calmer, more measured register, reasoning that the emotional intensity of her original approach was perhaps what was triggering the shutdown. She had tried being more direct, naming explicitly what she needed, rather than hoping he would understand from context. She had tried timing, choosing moments when he seemed more relaxed, when the children were settled, when the day's demands had subsided, and there was space for something real. None of it had produced the consistent change she was looking for. The shutdown continued, and with each recurrence, something in Megan had contracted a little further. The reaching had become less automatic. The hope that accompanied it had become more qualified. The specific ache of a woman who keeps extending her hand and keeps finding the space where his should be empty had become, gradually and without her full awareness, the background emotional weather of her marriage. What I want to explain now is what is actually happening in Ryan when he shuts down, because this is the clinical information that changes everything. The information that transforms the shutdown from a mysterious and personal rejection into a comprehensible psychological event with specific roots and specific implications for how it can be addressed. The shutdown is almost never what it appears to be. It does not appear from the outside as a complex internal event. It appears as a choice, as the decision of a man who could be present and is choosing not to be. And because it appears as a choice, it tends to be responded to as a choice, with the frustration and the escalating attempts to override the choice that the pursuer-distancer dynamic consistently generates. But in the vast majority of the cases I have worked with clinically, what appears to be a choice is not primarily a choice. It is a response, a physiological and psychological response to something that is happening in him, something that he himself often does not have adequate awareness of or language for, that makes genuine emotional presence in that specific moment genuinely unavailable rather than simply withheld. The research that explains this most clearly comes from the work of John Gottman, whose decades of studying couples in his laboratory produced some of the most practically important findings in the history of relationship psychology. Gottman documented a physiological state he called flooding, a state of autonomic nervous system activation that occurs when emotional intensity exceeds the nervous system's current processing capacity. When a person is flooded, the higher cognitive functions required for nuanced emotional communication, the capacity for empathy, for emotional regulation, for the kind of responsive presence that Megan was reaching for, become genuinely compromised, not strategically withheld, genuinely compromised in the same way that complex motor skills become compromised when the nervous system is in a state of acute stress. The flooded person is not choosing to be unavailable. They are, in the most literal neurological sense, unable to be available in the way that is being asked of them. And here is the clinical detail that changes everything about how this pattern is understood in marriage. Gottman's research found that male partners in distressed relationships reach the flooding threshold significantly faster than female partners and take significantly longer to recover from it. The male nervous system, on average and with all the individual variation that average implies, is more easily overwhelmed by emotional intensity and less quickly restored to the regulated state that genuine emotional presence requires. This is not a character flaw. It is not evidence of lesser love or lesser commitment. It is a neurological reality that has profound implications for how the shutdown is understood and how the response to it is calibrated. There is a layer beneath this that almost no one identifies, even in couples who have been in therapy and who have some understanding of the flooding dynamic. And it is the layer that explains why some men flood more easily than others, why some marriages produce flooding at much lower thresholds than others, and why the same man who shuts down reliably in intimate emotional conversations can be genuinely warm and emotionally present in other contexts. That layer is attachment history, and it is where the clinical work that produces lasting change always, without exception, begins. Ryan had grown up in a home that was, by every functional measure, a good home. His parents had loved him. He had been provided for, educated, supported in the ways that parents support children. But the emotional texture of that home had a specific quality that he had never fully examined. The quality of a place where emotional expression, particularly emotional expression, that involved vulnerability or need or the acknowledgement of pain, was not practiced. Not forbidden exactly, simply not modeled, not part of the available repertoire. His father had been a man who dealt with difficulty through action, through fixing, through providing, through the forward-moving competence that was the primary emotional language of the household. His mother had been warmer but had learned, through the decades of her own marriage, to contain her emotional needs within the bounds of what the household could receive without creating disruption. Ryan had absorbed all of this before he had language for any of it. He had learned, in the wordless and pre-rational way that children always learn the emotional rules of their environments, that need was something to be managed rather than expressed. That vulnerability was a private state rather than something to be brought to another person. That the appropriate response to emotional difficulty was competence, the quiet, forward-moving, keep it together competence that his father had modeled and that had been consistently rewarded in the environment in which he had become who he was. And so he had arrived at adulthood and at marriage with a specific and largely unconscious relationship to emotional need, both his own and others. His own need he managed with the practiced efficiency of someone who has been doing it since childhood. Others' need he encountered with the specific, involuntary quality of overwhelm that occurs when a nervous system that has never developed adequate emotional processing capacity is suddenly asked to process something that exceeds its range. The flooding was not a response to Megan specifically. It was the automatic activation of a system that had never been built for what she was asking of it. This is the point where everything can change, because once the shutdown is understood as a neurological and developmental response rather than a personal rejection, once the specific history that produced Ryan's particular emotional processing limitations becomes visible, the entire frame of the dynamic shifts. It is no longer the story of a woman whose need is being refused by a man who could meet it and is choosing not to. It is the story of two people, both shaped by histories they did not choose, trying to meet in a territory that one of them was never adequately equipped to navigate, and that story has a different set of possible responses than the first one. If you are recognizing Ryan's pattern in the man you are married to, if the description of the flooding, the attachment history, the learned management of emotional need has named something you have been living with without having this language for it, I want you to know that the ebook that accompanies this channel was built for exactly this moment. It contains a structured framework for understanding the specific attachment history that is operating in your marriage, and for beginning the work of addressing it in a way that creates genuine change, rather than simply managing the dynamic more skillfully. The link is in the description. Stay with me, because what comes next is the part that most content on this topic never reaches. The part that most content on this topic never reaches is the part about her, about what Megan's response to the shutdown has been doing to the dynamic. Not as blame, not as the redistribution of responsibility for a pattern that is genuinely complex and genuinely shared, but as the honest, clinically grounded recognition that the pursuer-distancer cycle is maintained by both people. That the escalation that feels most natural and most justified in the moment of the shutdown is, in the specific neurological reality of what is happening in Ryan when he floods, the response most likely to deepen the closing rather than interrupt it. Here is what happens in the dynamic from Ryan's side when Megan escalates. The flooding state, the state of autonomic activation that has already compromised his capacity for emotional presence, receives through her escalation additional input that the system is already struggling to process. The increase in emotional intensity, however justified, registers in his nervous system not as an invitation to be more present, but as an increase in the threat that triggered the flooding in the first place. The door does not open in response to the knocking. It closes more completely. And Megan, on the outside of the door, experiences the more complete closing as evidence that she needs to knock harder. And the cycle deepens. Gottman called this the demand-withdraw pattern, and his research identified it as one of the 4 relational dynamics most predictive of eventual marital dissolution. Not because the pattern itself is irreparable, but because it tends, without intervention, to become self-reinforcing in a way that progressively reduces the available space for genuine connection. each cycle of demand and withdrawal makes the next cycle more likely. Each closing makes the opening more effortful. Each instance of escalation followed by deeper retreat teaches both people's nervous systems that emotional need in this marriage is an event to be survived rather than an opportunity for connection. What interrupts the cycle is not better communication technique in the conventional sense. It is not the softer approach or the better timing or the more careful framing of the emotional need. All of those things can help at the margins, and I do not want to dismiss them, but they address the surface of the dynamic while leaving its foundation intact. What actually interrupts the cycle? What changes the neurological and relational reality, rather than simply managing it more skillfully, is something more fundamental. It is the development, on both sides and through different but equally important work, of what I am going to call regulated presence, the capacity to be genuinely emotionally present in an intimate exchange without the nervous system reaching the flooding threshold that makes presence impossible. For Ryan, the work of developing regulated presence begins with something that runs entirely counter to his conditioning. It begins with the willingness to notice the flooding before it becomes complete, to develop enough interoceptive awareness, enough ability to notice what is happening in his own body, that the signs of approaching overwhelm become visible to him before the door has fully closed. The increased heart rate, the specific quality of mental narrowing, the impulse to create distance or find something that needs doing elsewhere. These are all physiological signals that precede the full flooding state, and they are accessible to awareness if awareness has been cultivated. And with awareness comes, however gradually and however imperfectly, the possibility of choice. The possibility of saying, not necessarily out loud, not necessarily in that moment, I am approaching my limit. I need a moment to regulate before I can be present in the way she needs. This is the first practice I give to men who are working on this pattern, not the practice of being more emotionally expressive that is further down the road and requires a foundation that does not yet exist. The practice of noticing, the practice of developing enough relationship with their own physiological state that the flooding process becomes visible before it becomes total. It sounds almost absurdly simple. In practice, for a man who has spent decades not attending to his own internal states, it requires sustained and deliberate effort, but it is the foundation on which everything else is built. Because a man who can notice that he is flooding can begin to make choices in relation to it, can ask for a brief pause rather than simply disappearing, can say something honest about his own state rather than producing the managed, hollow responses that leave Megan feeling more alone than silence would, can begin very gradually and with all the imperfection that genuine change always involves, to stay. For Megan, the work is different and in some ways more counterintuitive, because the work that the dynamic requires of her is not the work of expressing her need more effectively or pursuing connection more skillfully. It is the work of interrupting the pursuit itself, of developing the capacity to recognize the early signs of Ryan's flooding and to respond to those signs not with escalation, but with something that goes entirely against the grain of what the moment feels like it requires, with a deliberate, conscious, internally generated step back. I want to be precise about what this step back is and what it is not. It is not the suppression of her need. It is not the acceptance of emotional unavailability as a permanent feature of the marriage that she must learn to live around. It is not the concession that her need is too much or that she should want less from her husband than she actually needs. What it is, what the clinical work consistently points toward as the response that actually changes the dynamic rather than simply managing it, is the recognition that the specific moment of flooding is not the moment in which her need can be met. That pressing harder in that moment does not produce connection. It produces the deeper closing that she most fears, and that stepping back, giving the nervous system on the other side of the dynamic the space to regulate, is not a defeat. It is a strategy, the only strategy that actually creates the conditions under which genuine presence becomes possible. This is the distinction that Megan found most difficult to internalize, and I want to stay with it because it is the distinction that most women in this dynamic find most difficult. The step back feels like abandoning her need. It feels like accepting the dynamic rather than challenging it. It feels, in the specific emotional logic of a woman who has been reaching and not finding for a long time, like giving up. And I want to name that feeling clearly and honestly. It is real, it is understandable, and it is not an accurate read of what the step back actually is. The step back is not the abandonment of the need. It is the postponement of the moment in which the need is brought to him from the moment of flooding, when meeting it is neurologically unavailable to him, to a different moment when the conditions for genuine presence have been restored. It is the recognition that timing is not a capitulation to his limitations, but a practical acknowledgement of how his nervous system works. And it is, in clinical practice, the single most consistently effective shift that women in this dynamic can make. Not because it eliminates the problem, but because it interrupts the cycle that was making the problem progressively worse. Megan practiced this step back for 6 weeks before she saw what I would call a meaningful change in Ryan's behavior. 6 weeks of noticing the early signs of his flooding and choosing, deliberately and against her own impulse, to say something that created space rather than something that pressed into the closing. Not always perfectly, not without the regressions and the nights when the accumulated frustration of the whole pattern overwhelmed the intention of the practice, but consistently enough that something began to shift in the emotional weather of their interactions. What shifted first was not Ryan's emotional availability. That came later and more gradually, and required its own work that I will describe in a moment. What shifted first was Megan's relationship with her own need. The 6 weeks of stepping back had done something she had not anticipated. It had given her, for the first time in years, the experience of not being entirely at the mercy of his response, of having, in the moment of the closing, somewhere to go that was not the escalation that had always followed it. She had developed a practice, brief, imperfect, genuinely effortful, of turning toward her own inner life in the moment when the door closed, of asking herself what she actually needed, specifically and honestly, and of finding ways to begin to meet that need that did not depend entirely on his availability in that particular moment. This is what I described in an earlier video as the return to the self, the practice of treating your own inner life as worth attending to, independent of what your partner is able to offer in any given moment. And what Megan discovered, as she practiced it, was something that surprised her with the specific quality of things that are obvious in retrospect and invisible before they are seen. That her own presence, her own capacity to be with herself in her difficulty, to witness her own need with the care and attention she had been hoping he would bring to it, was not nothing, was not a consolation prize, was in fact a form of genuine nourishment that she had been bypassing entirely in her orientation toward what he was or was not providing. Ryan noticed the change before he could name it. He told me later, when he had joined the work, which happened approximately 2 months after Megan began her practice, that something had shifted in the quality of her presence around him, that the specific quality of pressure he had always associated with the moments of her need, the quality that he now understood with the clinical framework we had been building together as the signal that had been triggering his flooding, had become less consuming. That there were moments when she brought something difficult to him and seemed, in a way he had not experienced before, to be bringing it without requiring him to be the only possible response to it, and that, in those moments, something in him had been able to stay that had not been able to stay before. This is the mechanism of change in the demand-withdraw dynamic when the work is done genuinely rather than strategically, not the performance of neediness in order to produce a different response, but the genuine internally generated shift in a woman's relationship with her own need that changes the emotional weather of the dynamic, that reduces in a real and physiological sense the flooding trigger that has been making genuine presence impossible for him. And in that reduced pressure, something becomes available that was not available before. Not immediately, not completely, but genuinely, and with a consistency that grows as the practice deepens on both sides. The conversation that marked the turning point for Megan and Ryan happened on a Saturday morning in early spring. The children were at Megan's mother's house. Ryan was in the kitchen making coffee, and Megan came in and sat at the table and said, without the careful management of approach and timing that had characterized her attempts to reach him for years, something that was simply true. She said, "I want to understand what happens to you when I bring you something hard, not to fix it, not to have a conversation about the marriage. Just because I want to understand you, and I realize I have been so focused on what I need from you in those moments that I have never actually asked what is happening for you in them." Ryan was quiet for a moment. Not the managed, going elsewhere quiet of the flooding response, something more available than that. And then he said something that Megan told me in our next session had been more honest than anything he had said to her in years. He said, "I feel like I am going to fail you every time before I have even tried. I feel the weight of what you need, and I know somewhere below the knowing that I am not going to be able to give it to you the way you need it. And instead of trying and failing in front of you, I disappear. Because disappearing feels safer than failing. This is the confession at the heart of the shutdown that most women never hear. Not indifference, not the absence of love or care or the desire to be present. The specific, deep, often unconscious fear of a man who loves his partner and does not believe he has what it takes to meet her in the territory she is asking him to enter. The shutdown is not the closing of someone who does not want to be there. It is the retreat of someone who is convinced, by a history that taught him this before he had words for it, that trying to be there will end in the particular humiliation of failing the person he most wants not to fail. Megan sat with this for a long moment, and then she said something that required, I want to be honest about this, more maturity and more genuine love than almost anything else she could have said in that moment. She said, "You have been failing me by not trying. But I would rather have you try and fail than disappear, because when you disappear, I am alone. When you try and it is not perfect, I am still with you. And being with you, even imperfectly, is what I have been asking for." The work that followed this conversation was real work, and it was long, and it required support that the two of them could not provide for each other alone. Ryan began gradually and with all the difficulty that genuine change in deeply encoded patterns always involves, to practice staying, to notice the flooding before it became complete, to say, in the moments when he felt the closing beginning, something honest about his own state rather than simply disappearing into it. The first attempts were awkward and the language was imprecise, and there were evenings when the old pattern reasserted itself completely. But the attempts were real, and real attempts, however imperfect, produce something that managed withdrawal never produces. They produce the experience, on both sides, of two people who are choosing to be in the difficulty together rather than managing their separate distances from it. The second practice that I give to couples working on this dynamic, the practice that builds on the regulated presence work and moves it into the ongoing texture of the marriage, is what I call the daily threshold check. This is a brief, low-stakes, explicitly non-loaded moment of genuine mutual inquiry that is built into the routine of the day before. The emotional intensity that triggers flooding has a chance to accumulate. Not a deep emotional conversation, not the kind of exchange that requires either person to be operating at full emotional capacity. Simply a moment, 5 minutes, over coffee or during a commute or in the 10 minutes before sleep, in which both people answer a single question honestly. The question is, what has been hardest today that you haven't said out loud? The power of the daily threshold check is not in the answer it produces. It is in the habit it builds. The habit of small, regular, low-stakes emotional disclosure that keeps the accumulation from reaching the levels that trigger flooding, that keeps both people practiced in the specific vulnerability of bringing something true to the other person in a context that does not require heroic emotional effort to navigate, that builds through daily repetition the specific neural pathways that make genuine emotional presence progressively more accessible. For him, because the practice of small disclosure develops the emotional vocabulary and the nervous system regulation that larger disclosure eventually requires, and for her, because the experience of being met in small things builds the trust that makes it possible to bring the large ones without the urgency of accumulated deprivation. The e-book contains the full framework for both practices, the step back and the daily threshold check, with detailed guidance for each stage of the process. It contains specific language for the conversation that Megan and Ryan had in the kitchen, with a structured path for what comes after that conversation when the opening is there, but the work of sustaining it has only just begun. And it contains a section specifically for the woman whose husband's shutdown has been so consistent and so long-standing that the very idea of genuine change feels more like a fantasy than a possibility, with the honest, clinically grounded account of what genuine change in this pattern actually requires and what it looks like when it is happening, so that the small signs of real movement are not missed in the waiting for the dramatic transformation that never arrives in a single moment. The link is in the description. If you have been living inside the pattern I described in this video, If the shutdown, the escalation, the deepening cycle of demand and withdrawal has been the dominant emotional architecture of your marriage, this is the next step. Not because it will be easy, because it will be real. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because this series continues and every video takes you somewhere deeper into the territory of what actually happens in marriages. Not the surface presentation, but the psychological reality beneath it, and what bringing that reality into conscious awareness makes possible that was not possible before. Jung said that everything that is not made conscious appears in our life as fate. Ryan's shutdown was not fate, it was psychology. It was the accumulated expression of a nervous system that had never been adequately equipped for what intimacy requires, operating in the space between him and the woman he loved, producing a distance that neither of them had chosen and that both of them had the capacity to close. Not instantly, not without the real, sustained, imperfect, entirely human work that genuine repair always requires, but genuinely, and with the specific, irreplaceable reward that only genuine repair produces, the experience of two people who chose, in the face of all the history and all the difficulty and all the accumulated distance, to keep trying to find each other. Your marriage is not defined by the shutdown. It is defined by what both of you choose to do with the understanding of what the shutdown actually is, and that choice, unlike fate, is always, still, yours to make. Welcome to the shadow of marriage, and welcome to the work that changes everything.